These three disturbing park ranger horror stories are inspired by real events. First, a tourist ignores a critical warning sign for a social media post, unaware that one slip will send her sliding into a grave that leaves no body behind. Next, a photographer trespasses into a closed section of the woods, only to realize the terrifying reason the park rangers abandoned it. And finally, a thrill seeker breaks into a sealed mine shaft against federal orders. Make sure you watch until the very end, because what he uncovers in the deep darkness isn't a hidden cave. It's a pile of 50 human skeletons staring right at him. Gabriel thought the extreme danger signs were just typical park warnings. But when she slipped into what looked like a peaceful mountain lake, she discovered that some forbidden waters are deadly for a very scientific reason. This all happened back in July of 2016. It felt like the last honest summer on Earth, you know? Before everything got loud. Up in Lassen Volcanic National Park, the heat baked the high ground, but the air was clean. It was sharp. You could smell the pine and the volcanic dust on the wind. The world felt beautiful, and it felt safe. That's the real trap, isn't it? That's how these things always start. They get you when you trust the world too much. Gabriel was there, 28 years old, a bigger woman, standing about 5'5" and weighing in at 200 pounds. And here's a detail that matters, the one that turned a bad choice into a fatal one. She had known issues with her balance. She wasn't steady on her feet on a good day. She was hiking with her friend Susanna. They were up near a thermal area called Boiling Springs Lake. Now, if you saw this lake, you'd understand the temptation. It's a strange sight. The water is a milky, almost supernatural blue, and it's steaming gently into the sky. It looks peaceful. It looks like a warm bath on a cold day. That contrast, that's the key. It looks like an invitation, but it's just ancient, silent poison. You can't blame the National Park Service. They did their job. They were very clear. They had yellow tape up. They had massive, heavy-duty wooden barriers hammered into the ground. The kind you don't just trip over. You have to make a real choice to cross them. And attached to these barriers were signs. Big ones, in your face. The lettering was sharp, aggressive, and left no room for doubt. Extreme danger, acidic water, death, or severe burns. Those aren't suggestions, they're not friendly advice. They are scientific warnings. They are a promise of exactly what that water will do to you. But Gabriel, she had her own agenda that day. She wasn't really looking at the park. She was looking at her phone. She needed a photograph, not a nice snapshot of her and her friend. No, she needed the perfect Instagram shot. Something intimate and unique. Something that showed her right on the edge of the forbidden, proving she was different, that the rules weren't for her. She wasn't just ignoring the warnings. She was actively seeking out the danger so she could use it for attention. Her friend Susanna knew better. She had common sense. She saw the signs, she felt the danger, and she pleaded with Gabriel. You could hear the real anxiety in her voice, begging her not to cross the barrier. Susanna was the last thin thread connecting Gabriel to reality, to common sense. But Gabriel had already made up her mind. The picture was more important. She ducked under the ropes. She stepped right over the heavy wood barrier, and just like that, she was on ground she was never supposed to touch. This ground in a thermal area isn't solid. It's not a hiking path. It's a mess. It's all mud, slick clay, and loose geothermal runoff. It's unstable, like wet quicksand just waiting to betray you. For Gabriel, with her known balance issues, this wasn't just a patch of mud. It was a lethal obstacle course. Every single step was a gamble. She ignored the slickness, though. She ignored the way the ground must have felt. shifting under her weight. She was focused on the lake. The water wasn't churning violently, which probably gave her a false sense of security. It was just steaming steadily, a fine, thin vapor rising into the clear air. But the smell, that was the other warning. The stench rising from that water was sharp. It was acrid. It was the earth showing you its guts. It was that unmistakable, gagging smell of rotten eggs, the sulfur. But it was mixed with something else too. A sharp, bitter chemical smell, and that metallic tang you get from an old car battery. It was the smell of poison. It was the kind of smell that makes the air feel thin and hard to breathe. Gabriel ignored that too. She crept along the edge, getting into position. She was determined to touch the water. A little gesture, a look at me, for a camera lens that wasn't even on her yet. She knelt down, getting onto her hands and knees. The ground felt slimy and insecure beneath her palms. She was balancing herself on poison mud. Now, here are the facts. Here is the scientific reason. The water temperature at Boiling Springs Lake is deceptive. It sits right around 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not technically boiling, no. But it is hot enough to cause immediate, full-thickness, third-degree burns. The kind that destroy your skin and the nerves underneath it instantly. But the heat was only half the problem. The true horror was its chemistry. Scientific measurements put the water's pH level at approximately 2.3. To give you some context, the battery acid in your car has a pH of about 1.0. This beautiful, steaming, milky blue lake was only one small step away from being a vat of pure, flesh-dissolving acid. When Gabriel lowered her hand and tapped the surface of that water, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. It was a flash burn. Her skin reacted instantly and violently to the acid and the heat. The pain was probably blinding, a sudden, searing shock that never even had time to register as a full scream. In that split second, the Instagram post was forgotten. The picture didn't matter. The only sane choice left was to retreat. Gabriel pulled her hand back, her skin already starting to peel away. She had the presence of mind to know she had to get out. She had to get back to safety. But getting up from that position, on her hands and knees, was the last physical challenge she would ever face. This is where the story stops being a mistake and becomes a full-blown tragedy. Straining to rise, her body weight shifted. Her hands and feet were pushing against that slick, treacherous, unstable mud. Her poor balance, the fatal flaw we mentioned, combined with the lethal terrain she had chosen. Her feet slipped out from under her. She lost all purchase on the unstable ground. She didn't trip. She didn't fall in slowly. She slid forward and went completely and fatally into the milky, steaming, blue acid bath. The sound that followed was not a human one. It was the hideous noise of fabric and flesh dissolving under the lethal combination of acid and superheated water. Susanna was already running toward the barrier, her mind screaming, "Don't go in there! Don't go in there!" She ran to help, but she was too late. There was no one to help. She saw the violence of the water as it took her friend, and she stopped dead. What she witnessed, what she has to live with, is this. Her friend Gabriel was no longer a person in the water. She was a terrible, churning process. Her clothes, made of synthetic fibers, disintegrated almost instantly. Her skin, already weakened by the initial contact, was essentially coming off in the corrosive water. The death was immediate and total. A massive, overwhelming shock to the system, combined with the rapid, devastating chemical and thermal trauma. There was no time for pain. There was no time for rescue. There was no time for a scream. Gabriel was simply consumed by the Earth's natural hidden malevolence. It took 15 minutes for Park Ranger Miller to get there. The rangers were scattered all over the park, but he got there as fast as he could. When he arrived, the horrific truth of that water's power was laid bare. It had only been 15 minutes, but in that time, the combination of 160-degree heat and battery-level acid had done its work. All of Gabriel's soft tissue was gone, dissolved. There were just floating pieces of what looked like brightly colored cloth, the last remnants of her clothing, swirling in that milky blue water. The acidic, heated lake had rapidly and completely decomposed her. There was almost nothing left of the person who had only minutes before wanted a picture. The aftermath was cold and official, just like the warnings. Susanna, the witness, the friend who had run toward the scene, was found in violation of federal law. She had trespassed. She had interfered with the death investigation. The system doesn't care about your intentions in a moment of panic. It just sees the rules that were broken. She faced the consequences: a stiff fine of $11,500 and a 10-year ban from all national parks. The system delivered its punishment. But the true penalty, the one that matters, was the image seared into Susanna's memory. The image of her friend dissolving in that hot chemical grave. This is the unsettling end of the matter. Boiling Springs Lake has been naturally acidic for thousands of years. It's always been capable of this horrifying destruction. At any time, it just waits. It sits there, beautiful and steaming. And sometimes a single foolish step is all it takes to realize that the difference between a natural wonder and a natural weapon is just a pH level and a fence. The lake is still there, and the signs are still up. They are waiting for the next person who values a photograph over a life. When James decided to ignore the danger wolf territory signs and hike into closed Yellowstone wilderness, he thought he was just getting better photos. But what he didn't know was that he was walking into a wolf's most sacred ground, and the wolf was about to show him exactly why some areas are forbidden. James was a 34-year-old guy from Denver, Colorado, and in September 2015, he was in a bad mood. He'd spent a lot of money to come to Yellowstone National Park, and he had a camera bag full of expensive lenses. But every picture he took looked, well, it looked like something his aunt could take on her phone. He had pictures of bison from a mile away. He had pictures of the geysers with 100 other people in the shot. It was all too safe, too clean, too touristy. He felt like a fraud, and he was getting frustrated. He wanted something real, something raw. That's when he saw the signs. He was in the Pelican Valley area, and he'd come to the end of the public trail. There was a low metal barrier and a couple of big, bright, impossible-to-miss signs. One said, "Danger, wolf territory, stay out." The other said, "Closed area." James wasn't stupid. He knew how to read. He knew those signs were put there by park rangers, guys like Ranger Cassidy and Ranger Rhett, who had to deal with people like him all day. The rangers had shut this whole area down for a good reason. One of the park's gray wolf packs had set up a den nearby. And it wasn't just any pack. Yellowstone only had about 95 of these wolves in the whole park. This was a critical recovery population, and this pack had newborn pups. This spot was a nursery. It was one of the most protected, sensitive places in North America. James saw the signs. He saw the barrier. He looked over his shoulder. Nobody. No rangers, no other hikers. Just him and the trees. And in that moment, he made a decision. He was filled with that specific kind of arrogance that gets people killed. He told himself the rules were for other people. The clumsy tourists. The ones who didn't respect nature. He, on the other hand, was a photographer. He was skilled. He knew what he was doing. He was just going to be a ghost, in and out. Get the shot, get the glory. He put one leg over the barrier, then the other. He was in. He started walking, pushing past the official boundary, leaving the safe world behind. He hiked for 2 miles into the restricted zone. 2 miles. Every step was a federal crime. Every step took him deeper into a place he was warned not to go. He thought he was hunting for art. He had no idea he was the one being hunted. The first mile was just trees. He felt excited, like he was getting away with something. His heart was pumping. This was real adventure. But then, after about 30 minutes, the forest changed. The air changed. It wasn't just the clean smell of pine and damp earth anymore. He smelled something else. It was a sharp, musky scent. A heavy, animal smell. The clean, pungent odor of a large predator. At the same time, he noticed something else. The woods were quiet, not just peaceful quiet. This was a dead, heavy silence. The little birds and squirrels he'd heard back on the main trail, all gone. It was the kind of silence that feels like every creature for a mile around is holding its breath, watching. The silence was unnatural, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on his chest, making his own breathing sound loud and ragged in the close air. He should have turned back. Any sane person would have turned back. But James, he just gripped his camera strap and kept going. He started noticing details that were not normal. On a patch of soft dirt near a stream, he saw a paw print. It was huge, bigger than his fist, bigger than any dog print he had ever seen. The claws had dug in deep, and the mud was still settling. Whatever left it was close. He smiled to himself, feeling like a successful adventurer, a true archaeologist of the wild. He actually knelt and took a picture of the print. A few minutes later, he stopped short. He heard a noise. It was low and deep, a sound that seemed to come from the deep forest floor itself. A faint, short, territorial growl. It was quickly cut off. It was a clear warning. It said, "We know you're here. Get out." James dismissed it. He told himself it was a bear, maybe, probably far away. He was so focused on his goal, on getting the picture that would make everyone back in Denver jealous, that his common sense had just packed up and left. His heart was speeding up, sure, but his mission was more important. He came around the corner of a ridge, pushed through a thick curtain of low-hanging branches, and he finally saw it. Tucked under the massive, tangled roots of a giant ancient cedar, he saw a dark opening in the earth, a den. He'd found it. He could hear faint, high-pitched yips coming from inside. Pups. This was the jackpot. He raised his camera, his hands shaking a little now, but with excitement, not fear. He put the viewfinder to his eye, ready to snap the image that would define his whole trip. That was the moment the forest stopped being quiet and started screaming. The alpha male wolf didn't appear from the trees. It was simply there. 1 second, James was alone. The next, a 130-pound shape of powerful muscle and gray-black fur was standing between him and the den. It hadn't made a sound. It was just suddenly, impossibly, there. James froze. The wolf made a sudden, chilling noise, a low, full-throated snarl that scraped across the silence and rattled the leaves. It was a sound of pure, protective rage, and in that instant James realized with a rush of icy fear that left a metallic taste in his mouth that he was no longer a photographer. He was a threat. He was a mortal threat standing on the wolf's most sacred ground, just feet from its newborn children. The wolf moved with an impossible, terrifying speed. It was a gray blur of violent purpose. James stumbled backward, dropping his expensive camera. It hit the dirt with a soft, muffled thud. He tried to yell, but the sound caught in his throat, coming out as a strained, desperate gasp. The animal closed the distance in a fraction of a second. The first bite was a catastrophic, tearing impact on his left thigh. The sound it made was wet and sickening, like a thick piece of cloth being ripped apart. James hit the ground, and the wolf was instantly on him, a weight of focused, killing instinct. He screamed, a raw, high shout of pure pain that echoed through the empty valley, but the sound was already muffled by the wolf's relentless, calculated attack. Every bite was precise. This wasn't a rabid, wild attack. This was a measured, defensive destruction. It was intended not just to wound, but to disable. He felt a sharp, splintering crack in his lower leg as the wolf's jaws found bone. He managed to get his arms up, a futile defense, and the wolf shifted targets, its teeth sinking deep into his forearms. He could hear the sound of his own skin and muscle tearing under the pressure, a grotesque, squelching noise. The pain was blinding, white-hot, overwhelming all his senses. He tried to roll away, to kick, but the wolf was a heavy, immovable weight, pinning him to the ground. It was during this savage, horrifying struggle that the wolf's final, targeted attack occurred. The animal, in its fury to protect its den, lunged and tore at his groin. It was an injury so specific, so violating, and so catastrophic that James's body went into immediate catastrophic shock. He was savagely mutilated, losing his genitals in a single ripping motion. He just lay there, the world turning gray and distant. He was breathing shallow, ragged breaths. His world narrowed to the sound of his own heavy bleeding. And then, as quickly as it started, it was over. The wolf was gone. It had neutralized the threat. It melted back into the trees, its territory defended. James lay there for 45 agonizing minutes. 45 minutes alone, bleeding heavily, staring up at the trees, thinking about a picture he wanted to take. Finally, Ranger Cassidy and Ranger Rhett found him. They'd been on patrol and had heard that first high-pitched scream. They ran toward the sound. The scene they found was a tableau of arrogant human ambition completely destroyed by natural law. James was pale, soaked in his own blood, his clothes shredded, his body savagely torn. The only sounds were the Rangers' sudden shocked voices yelling into their radios and James's weak, whimpering cries. The emergency response was swift. Pilot Benjamin was called in for a life-saving helicopter evacuation. The sound of the rotors quickly grew, chopping the air, signaling James's agonizing departure from the Forbidden Valley. They flew him straight to the hospital in Bozeman. He survived. But the horror did not end in the hospital. As soon as he was stable, he was met by Ranger Vaughn, a federal investigator. James was charged with violating the Endangered Species Act and trespassing in a protected zone. The facts were undeniable. He broke the law. He was responsible for his own injuries, and he had endangered a vital, recovering wolf pack. The consequences were as cold and final as the woods. James was fined $5,000. He was banned from all federal lands for 3 years. And in a final, brutal twist of irony, he was ordered to pay $12,000 toward his own catastrophic medical costs. The wolf pack was left alone, its sacred ground defended. James got his intense photographs that day, the one of the paw print, the one of the blurry trees as he fell. Though he probably never looked at them, he got his story, but he paid for it by losing a piece of himself, by losing his sense of safety in the world, and by being forced to confront the absolute, unforgiving truth of nature, that some signs are not suggestions, some signs are just promises. Ask yourself how many times you've ignored a simple "stay out" sign and how close you might have been to finding out exactly why it was posted. Caleb thought he was discovering a hidden underground adventure in the Nevada desert. But when he climbed down an abandoned mine shaft that Ranger Stone had specifically sealed off, he found himself in a tomb of toxic gases, where the skeletal remains of 50 others proved he was not the mine's first victim. He was 37 years old, hailing from Las Vegas, and he had a problem with authority. Not the kind that gets you in fistfights, but the kind that makes you see a keep out sign as a personal invitation. He figured rules were for tourists, for the soft people who didn't know how to handle themselves. He, on the other hand, saw himself as an explorer, a man who could test his limits. This was September 2015, and his search for a real challenge had brought him to the Great Basin National Park in Nevada. He'd left the main roads behind, driving his truck deep into the Snake Creek area, a vast empty stretch of high desert country. This land was beautiful, but it was also scarred. The whole area was a historic mining district, pockmarked with the leftovers of 1920s mining operations. Men had come here a century ago chasing mercury, and they'd left a poisoned, unstable mess behind. The Park Service, led by a no-nonsense supervisor named Ranger Stone, knew the dangers. They had spent a lot of time and money trying to seal these places up, trying to protect people like Caleb from themselves. Caleb parked his truck, grabbed his heavy pack, and hiked for a mile off the marked trail. He was looking for something the brochures didn't show, and he found it. It was a cluster of rotting wooden structures, the bones of an old mercury mine. Ranger Stone's crew had been here all right. This wasn't just a simple chain. They had crisscrossed heavy beams over the main shaft. They had wrapped the whole thing in bright orange mesh fencing, the industrial kind, and zip-tied it to every solid post. And then there were the signs, bolted right to the wood. Caleb read the first one. Danger, abandoned mine, toxic fumes, death. He smirked. That was just for lawyers. He looked at the second sign, nailed just below it. Structurally unsafe. That, he thought, was just a lack of confidence. He didn't see a warning. He saw a challenge. He dropped his pack, pulled out his climbing gear, and got to work. He wasn't subtle. He took a pair of bolt cutters to the cables holding the mesh. The snap of the metal echoed in the dry air. He used a small folding saw to cut through the rotted support beams. The wood was soft, and it only took him 30 minutes of hard work, sweating under the Nevada sun, to clear a hole. He peered down. It was a 40-foot vertical drop, a black throat leading into the earth. He was here to explore underground wonders, and this was the entrance. He strapped on his harness, clipped his climbing line to a beam he decided was sturdy enough, and double-checked his knots. He stepped over the edge and began his descent. The first 20 feet were easy. It was just him, his rope, and the scrape of his boots on the coarse rock wall. The light from the surface was a bright, perfect circle above him. The silence was absolute, broken only by his own rhythmic breathing. The deeper he went, the more the outside world vanished. The circle of light above him shrank, turning from bright white to a dull, sickly yellow. The silence changed too. It became heavy, pressing in on him, as if the darkness had a physical weight. He was 30 feet down when the air changed. It wasn't that it was thin, it was thick. He took a breath and tasted it. It was a strange, artificial sweetness, like the smell of rotten eggs trying to hide behind chemicals. It was a cloying, heavy smell that stuck to the back of his throat. Caleb was a smart guy. He knew this was bad. But he told himself it was just the smell of old mine dust, of decaying wood, of a place that had been sealed for decades. He was almost at the bottom. He kept going. His boots touched the floor of the first level. The shaft was 40 feet deep, and he had landed on a ledge 30 feet down. The smell was 10 times worse here. It made his eyes water and his throat burn. He unclipped his harness. The first thing that hit him was a headache. It wasn't a slow-building ache. It was a sudden, sharp spike of pressure behind his eyes, as if someone had hit him with a hammer. He took a few deep breaths to try and clear his head, but the air felt like breathing through a wet cloth. A dry, ragged cough burst from his chest, and the sound of it echoed off the damp stone walls. He knew intellectually that the warning signs meant something. Hydrogen sulfide gas, mercury vapor. These were the real residues of decades-old mining. But the signs were always an exaggeration, right? He tried to rationalize the feeling. It was just a little panic. It was just stale air. He'd be fine. He switched on his headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness. He was in a small chamber, a passage leading off the main shaft. He wanted to see the wonders. He swept the light across the floor, and then he saw them. Tucked back into the wall of the passage, there was a cluster of objects that didn't look like rocks. He stepped closer, the beam settling on a shape. It was a human skull. The cough turned into a frantic, choking mess. This wasn't panic anymore. This was his body screaming a single clear command: get out. He fumbled for his harness, his hands suddenly clumsy, slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. The sickeningly sweet air tasted like raw metal in his mouth, a flavor that was both poison and fear. His focus was tunneling. The headlamp beam, which he could barely hold steady, swung wildly across the dirt floor as he stumbled back. The light fell on something deeper in the shaft, a drop-off he hadn't noticed before. It was a lower level, and it was filled with shapes, dozens of them, white and pale against the black rock, stacked and scattered in the shadows. Not rocks, not dust. These were whole skeletons, 50 of them piled up in the darkness. The skeletal remains lay right where they fell. He was not the mine's first victim. He was just the most recent. The realization hit him at the same moment the toxic gas finally and completely overwhelmed his system. It wasn't a sudden cinematic blackout. It was a rapid, quiet fading. The roaring in his ears, which had been loud from his frantic, shallow breaths, suddenly started to go thin, like the volume was being slowly turned down. His vision blurred into a gray soup. He tried to yell, tried to scramble back toward his line, but the chemical poison had already dissolved his strength. He passed out within minutes, his body slumping onto the cold, damp ground next to the bones of the others. His breathing became faint, erratic, and shallow. The heavy air in the mine, now measured at 400 times above the safe exposure limit, was doing its quiet, deadly work. 2 hours later, pure luck intervened. A Park Service truck rolled to a stop near the mine. Ranger Stone, the man responsible for sealing these shafts, just happened to be in sight, making a routine check in the Snake Creek area. He saw the disturbed earth. He saw the ripped-apart fencing and the splintered beams. His stomach dropped. Then he saw the nylon climbing rope hanging from the beam, leading down into the dark. There was no sign of anyone below. Stone immediately grabbed his radio. This wasn't a search. This was a recovery operation. Lead rescue tech. Liam and his team arrived quickly. They came with specialized gas detection equipment and full breathing apparatus. They knew exactly what was waiting down there. The moment they lowered the first instrument, the alarm screamed. The air was profoundly tainted. Liam clipped in and went down, breathing clean air from a tank. He found Caleb 30 feet down, unconscious, barely breathing. The team worked fast, securing the dead weight of Caleb's body to a line and hauling him out of the toxic air and into the sunlit world that had tried so hard to warn him. The whole rescue team got out clean. They were professionals. Caleb was evacuated by helicopter and sent for immediate medical treatment. The doctors saved his life, but the poison had been in his system for too long. The hydrogen sulfide and mercury vapor had saturated his blood and starved his brain of oxygen. Caleb survived, but he didn't recover. He was left with permanent, devastating brain damage. He became a vegetable. The man who had hiked miles to find an adventure could no longer walk, talk, or care for himself, a living casualty left for his family to take care of. The federal charges were filed. The $12,000 fine was issued. But it was all meaningless. Caleb's life, as he knew it, was already over. Ranger Stone's crew returned to the mine. This time, they didn't use wood and wire. They brought in a cement truck and sealed the mine permanently with thick, dense concrete barriers. The mercury contamination persists underground to this day. The 50 skeletons are still down there. Caleb thought he was breaking a rule. What he actually did was walk into a tomb. His fate became the final, most brutal warning sign, a living testament to the indifferent, silent poison still waiting in the dark.